Where were you born and raised, sir?
I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1928. I lived there until about 1950 when I went to Boston. Been here ever since.
Oh, wow, wow, that's amazing. So, in Boston, now, what brought you to Boston early on?
Well, I managed to get a very good graduate fellowship at Harvard, which was very tempting. It was the first time in my life I didn't have to work, and had all the resources of Harvard available. Several years, it was irresistible temptation. I've just stayed ever since.
Wow, that's amazing. And sir, and Mr. Noam, what year was that, or what decade? About what time period was that?
I came to Boston in 1951, and I was at Harvard for 4 years, and then switched over to MIT in 1955, and I've been at MIT ever since. That's where I'm speaking now.
Oh wow, that's absolutely fascinating. Again, and we are so grateful for your time. But getting to 1951, a whole nother time period in America. You got the height of the Cold War. You got so much going on. Question is this: what do you see, sir, from your perspective? Is the difference or similarities between, the decade of the 1950s or 1951 till now, 2014? What's the comparison from your perspective, sir?
Quite a lot has changed. The activism of the 1960s had a significant civilizing effect on the country. So many things that are fortunately more or less taken for granted today, not settled, but at least recognized to be significant and important, were not even on the agenda at the time. For example, women's rights, which is quite probably the major achievement of the past generation. We might remember that women were not, if you go back in American history to the Revolution, the colonies took over British common law, under which women were really not people. They were property owned by their father, transmitted to their husband. There was activist opposition for years, but it really took off in the 60s. And it was literally not until 1975 that the Supreme Court finally recognized that women can be regarded as peers. They have a right to serve in federal juries. It's a sign of equality. And many things have changed in that respect. The civil rights movement was just beginning to take off in 1961. That had significant, though limited, effects. 1961 is when I became personally directly involved in protesting the invasion of Indochina. There was virtually no support for that at the time. It was an unheard of issue. In fact, people, even today, almost nobody knows that in 1961, 1962, President Kennedy launched a major attack on South Vietnam with American Air Force bombing villages, chemical warfare to destroy crops, driving people into what amounted to concentration camps, a major attack. Well, by now, within a couple of years, there developed a significant opposition to American aggression in Vietnam, and that's changed the character of the country too. It remains a significant opposition to the kinds of actions that at the time were taken without concern. All of this is progress. There was no concern at the time for the environmental crisis, which at least now is recognized by many people to be extremely severe, not by enough. So all of that is progress. On the other hand, there was a backlash as you'd expect. The civilizing effect of the 60s led to an immediate backlash in the following years. The institution of the essentially neoliberal assault on the population, which takes many forms, and has led to a very significant regression. So just to give some things that we ought to all be familiar with, real wages for male workers today are about at the level of 1968. There has been economic growth in the last 30 years, not the same level as before, but significant. However, almost all of it has gone into the pockets of a very small number of people. For most of the population, it's been stagnation, relative stagnation, or decline. There's a major attack on unions, attack on the educational system. There are lots of things happening that are very harmful. Partly an effort to beat back the progress that began in the early 60s. And that's a conflict that goes on through American history. We're in a regressive stage of it now, but we've come out of it before and could again.
Oh, sir, I tell you, you speak so eloquently and so honestly from the heart, it feels. And I have a question that, that just dawned on me, speaking for so many decades, sir, speaking truth in the face of, or speaking from a perspective that is more broad, more educated, what was the spark in you, sir, in your life that said, you know what? I want to be this person who is honest, and I want to be this person who speaks to the world about the truth. When did that happen in your life, sir?
I can't really say. It simply goes back to early childhood. Never questioned it. I mean, I grew up during the Depression, and objectively it was much worse than today, although subjectively it was better in the sense that there was a sense of hope and optimism, and we can work together and get out of this and so on, feelings that are kind of absent today. But in the Depression period, there was simply, at least from my point of view, no question from early childhood that one had to commit oneself to combat the deep injustices, repression, violence. The threat of fascism was then expanding over the world. There were extraordinary problems at home. Somehow the question you raise just never arose.
Well, I guess I feel honored since being that person that's asked that question that's never arose yet. Sir, you mentioned the education system, and I'm somebody that's immersed within that and very near and dear to my heart. What do you believe, or what do you see as some of the major obstacles of American education in 2014?
Well, the educational system, unfortunately, is under pretty severe attack. It's not called attack, it's called reform. But you should always be very cautious when you hear the word reform and ask what it actually means. The educational system is badly underfunded. Schools are in disrepair. There aren't enough teachers. Teachers are poorly paid. There are efforts to get around the to undermine the public education system by setting up alternatives. Mass public education was one of the great achievements of American society back in the late 19th century, and it has had enormous positive consequences, and it's now under attack from the kindergarten level right through the universities. At the K-12 level, the school level, education is being shifted under government policy to what amounts to training for obedience, teaching to test, which is a perfect way to undermine and dull creativity, interest, searching for seeking your own understanding of yourself and the world. Is absolutely the worst form of educational policy, deadening and destructive, and that's being imposed all over. At the university level, the United States still has the greatest universities in the world, but the system is severely under attack. It's again the scientific research, which is not only of enormous significance in itself, but is also the basis for future economic development. That's under attack from Congress. In fact, just take a look at the figures. The research and development funding by the federal government has declined about 25% relative to the economy in the past decade, at the same time when everywhere else, Europe, Japan, China, it's going up. The students now leave college typically with an extremely heavy debt burden. There's no economic basis for that, but it does have it has a sharp disciplinary effect. It limits the opportunities for what you can do for obvious reasons. You have to pay off your debt. And again, it's worth stressing that that is not an economic necessity. We can see that very easily. Just take a look across the border at Mexico, a poor country, with a pretty good higher education system, but education's free. There was an attempt about 20 years ago to raise tuition, to add a little tuition, low tuition. There was a student strike, national student strike, got enormous popular support, and the government backed down. Well, that's Mexico. Take a look at the rich countries that regularly score the highest in educational achievement, like Finland, Germany, others. Education's free. Higher education's free. In fact, even in the United States, when it was a much poorer country than it is today, back in the 1950s, education for a very large part of the population was essentially free. That's the GI Bill. Brought a huge number of people into the colleges and universities who never would have been able to make it on their own. That was of enormous benefit to them, of course, but also to the society. That's a large part of the reason for the rapid economic growth rate, scientific discovery is the basis of the high-tech economy that we have today. It was mostly established then through federal spending, incidentally. Even in the private colleges, like I went to an Ivy League college, University of Pennsylvania, in 1945, but the tuition was extremely low. I think it was $100 at the time, and you could easily get a scholarship.
Wow.
These are not economic necessities. However one wants to debate the cause, the effect is to impose discipline and passivity on young people who are at a time of their lives when they should be free to explore, to figure out who they are, to find their own way in life, to understand the world, to become engaged in public issues, to pursue their own interests and so on. But that's being sharply constrained. Well, none of this is necessary. These are all social policies, and they're closely integrated, in my opinion, with the policies that are, in fact, imposing something like stagnation, often decline, on the large majority of the population, which is not an economic necessity either. I mean, take our current socioeconomic situation. Just look at the country today. There are tens of millions of people who want to work and are capable of working, have the skills to work, and cannot get jobs. The unemployment figures are misleading because many have just dropped out of the workforce in despair. So a huge number of willing and idle hands. There's an enormous amount of work that has to be done. I drove into work this morning. Like every day when I drive to work, I have to try to guess where the detour is going to be because they're patching up some street that's falling apart. And,
That's great.
Literally, and that goes everywhere. I mean, our health system is an absolute scandal. Twice the per capita cost of other countries and some of the worst outcomes. The American Society of Engineers gives an evaluation of infrastructure every year. They've given failing grades to the United States for years. The country's falling apart. Plenty of work to be done. There's a need for construction, for teachers, for scientific research, for just about everything you can think of. So plenty of work to be done, plenty of idle hands, huge resources available. The corporate sector and the banks are richer than they've ever been. There's so much money they don't know what to do with it. So idle hands, work to be done, plenty of resources. The society can't put them together. You can hardly have a sharper indictment of a socioeconomic system. And there are very serious dangers ahead. You want to have a look at it and the way we're dealing at them, I'd simply suggest taking a look at this morning's New York Times. It has a separate section on energy, and that's very much worth reading. The section is pretty much euphoric. We can become the Saudi Arabia of the 21st century. We can have 100 years of energy independence. There's endless amounts of fossil fuel that we can produce and use and export. There are maybe some problems, like maybe the price won't be right, but generally it looks just wonderful. There's one thing missing in that section. What's the world going to look like in 100 years if we exploit all of our fossil fuel resources? Now we're heading towards a cliff, like the proverbial lemmings, and we're going to create a world in which there won't be possibilities for decent survival. So what happens to our grandchildren? That question simply doesn't arise. The moral calculus of today's form of capitalism is that profits tomorrow far outweigh the fate of your grandchildren. This is the first time in human history that we have been on the verge of destroying the possibility for decent existence, and we're marching as fast as we can towards that cliff. The section I just mentioned is a good illustration of it. All of for this, there's an enormous amount of work to be done in this regard, from weatherization of homes to wind farms and solar panels, more advanced scientific research and so on. It's not being done because we have to maximize the profit tomorrow for a very small number of people, very small fraction of 1%.
Man, oh gosh, sir, I ask you then, are you a spiritual individual? Is there something beyond all of this politics and all of this, this earthbound heaviness it feels? What's your perspective, sir, on spirituality, and does that go hand in hand with religion or anything of that nature?
Well, our future is in our hands, as always. What I've just described is not inevitable. It's not a law of nature. It's a characteristic of a particular form of social organization, social and political organization. And it relates to the mentality and mood of the population. There are many pressures that lead people to be passive, acquiescent, lacking hope, isolated from one another. And if those pressures are not resisted, we're heading for disaster. But they can be resisted, as they have been in the past. You began by mentioning 1961. It's a good place to look. That was a moment when these pressures for passivity began to be resisted. The 1950s was a very quiescent period. There wasn't much going on, some, but not a lot. By 1961, it was beginning to change dramatically, and it can again.
That's optimistic. That is good to hear. That it can again. I guess. How will it, sir? Like, how will it? The people? Will it be the people and the love and the intellect and the education that will change it?
Well, people have to simply decide. You have to first. You have to recognize reality. What is the nature of the world that we're living in? I mean, I've made a couple of comments, but you have to go far beyond that. So try to understand the nature of the reality that we live in. Recognize the severe threats that are right on the horizon and that will materialize unless we do something about them. And then make the decision. Do I want to do something about this? Do I care enough about, say, my grandchildren to want to avert coming disasters, to even apart from the major problem, huge problem of environmental disaster, just the social and economic disaster that I described before, of tens of millions of idle hands, plenty of work to be done, plenty of resources, can't put them together, stagnation for most of the population. This is not torture and massacre, but it's pretty bad news. Can we do something? Do I want to do something about that? We can. It's been done before. We can do it today. And ultimately, that's a decision that people have to make. They've made it before. They can again.
That's beautiful, sir. Thank you. Mr. Noam Chomsky, sir, we're coming on the last 2.5 minutes, and I know you are a busy man, and we can't thank you enough at the Networking Show for your time. An absolute honor. I've studied you for years, sir, and to have this time, I and everyone here at the network truly appreciate your time and everything that you stand for. Sir, I want to ask you 2 quick questions that I ask all of my featured guests, and it's really cool because we have a really cool insight from a lot of guests. But it's a simple question, but our audience can get a feel to say, oh, I have that same interest. Sir, I want to ask you, Mr. Noam Chomsky, what is your favorite color and why, if you have one?
My favorite color? Well, I guess blue. I love to look at, I don't know why, but I love to look at the ocean, at a lake, a bay. I can't do it anymore, I'm too old, but one of the real joys in life was sailing a small sailboat out in out late afternoon in the peaceful bay waters off Massachusetts. And it's the blue of the water and the sky is just somehow overwhelming.
That was beautiful. Thank you, sir. Last and final question, and you can switch this for music. But who are one of your favorite authors, and what is one of your favorite books? And if you want to switch that for music, I understand because you're an author and you're an amazing writer, so you probably have a lot that you've written and people you know.
Well, there are too many to mention. There are books that I go back to and reread. Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov is one. When I think of favorite authors, it's usually what I've just finished reading, interesting stuff that I've read recently. Just recently, I happen to have read a couple of novels by a great 19th century Brazilian novelist, Machado de Assis. So that's on my mind. But next week it'll be something else.
Are you a jazz person? Do you like jazz music?
It's an interesting question. I was taken to my first jazz concert ever about 2 or 3 months ago, and I enjoyed it.
Wow, that's amazing. Sir, Mr. Noam Chomsky, we've come on the half hour, and I do not want to take any more of your time. I am respectful, and I am very grateful. I want you to know that you are now a friend of the Subjective Perspective Show and the Bud and Roach Entertainment Network, and we wish you and your entire group of amazing assistants and all your students the most inspired and beautiful week ahead and year ahead. And if we are ever honored to have you on down the road again, gosh, Noam, whenever you need, sir, we're here for you. Totally.
Well, great pleasure to be with you. Enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much, sir. And we wish you the most beautiful, beautiful day. And we're going to go into a commercial break, everybody, with John Sinclair, Homage to Muddy Waters. This is the great Noam Chomsky.